Okay. Well, my name is still Georgia Warnke. And I'm still, at least temporarily, the director of the Center for Ideas and Society, which is the host of the conference for which this is the keynote. Our conference is supported by a Mellon grant, the Advancing Intercultural Studies grant, which supported 4 seminars over 2 years. Each seminar focused on a kind of issue of religious conflict, of diversity in higher education, contested histories, economic inequality. Each was peopled by 4 faculty members, 4 graduate students, and 4 undergraduates. And we have been listening to the results of those seminars for the past 2 days. And today we get to cap it all off with a talk by Thomas Frank. Tonight's session will be moderated by Stephen Brint, so I will introduce Professor Stephen Brint, and then he will introduce Thomas Frank. Stephen Brint is Distinguished Professor of Sociology and Public Policy here at the University of California, Riverside. Along with numerous articles, he is the author of 4 books: The Diverted Dream, Oxford University Press, 1989, In an Age of Experts, Princeton University Press, 1994, Schools and Societies, Pine Forge Sage Press, 1998, within a 3rd edition with Stanford University Press in 2010, and most recently, 2 Cheers for Higher Education, Princeton, 2018. He is also the editor of The Future of the City of Intellect and the co-editor of the 2-volume series, Evangelicals and Democracy in America. His thoughts on the current state and future of U.S. higher education were included in a special issue of the Chronicle of Higher Education, published in 2016, November 7th. Commemorating the 50th anniversary of the Chronicle. So I'll turn it over to Professor Brint, who will introduce Thomas.
Thank you, Georgia. Well, I met Tom Frank just today, but I've been a fan of Thomas Frank for a long time. In fact, since I saw the first review of What's the Matter with Kansas. And the reason for that is that the loneliest summer of my life was spent knocking on doors for a Democratic candidate for Congress in Johnson County, Kansas, where Tom and I both grew up. And I've also been, like him, circling around these issues of why is it that workers in the United States have had this sort of bait and switch with the Republican Party and have tended to align with the Republican Party? Why have the liberals lost their way? And a number of the issues that I've explored in my work is I've drawn inspiration from Tom's writing. So Tom is the author of, most of you know the book, What's the Matter with Kansas? And those of you who don't know the book really ought to take a look at it. It tells you a whole lot about American society and American politics. Another book of his, which is very well read, is Listen Liberal, more recent book. So he's had a wonderful career. He's been an editor of the Baffler. He was a founding editor of the Baffler, wrote a column for the Wall Street Journal for several years, has been a prolific author. And I know that he will provide a very trenchant analysis of American social and political life tonight. He's a brilliant writer, and I'm quite certain very stimulating raconteur and speaker. So let's welcome Thomas Frank.
Thank you, guys. That's very kind of you. So how y'all doing today? What a beautiful day it is in Riverside, California. By the way, what is the mascot? What is the mascot? What? Scotty Bear. A kilt-wearing bear. And he lives by a river. He's in Riverside. He's a highland bear. So he lives on a mountain that has a river going through it. Okay, I'm sorry. I'm sorry, I'm not, it doesn't really matter. It has nothing to do with the subject at hand, as a matter of fact. What am I going to talk about inequality, going to talk about social class, going to talk some about politics too. And I should mention that I'm one of that Professor Brint's book about professionals was a very important source for my book, Listen Liberal, which is about how the Democratic Party has gone wrong over the years. And I wrote it, I should say, I wrote it well before the 2016 election. In fact, I wasn't even paying attention to what was going on in politics when I was writing it. And then I got done, and I remember I turned it in, and one of my kids, we were having dinner after that, and one of my kids said, Daddy, Donald Trump is going to be the Republican candidate. I'm like, the guy from TV? The guy with the hair? I couldn't believe it, And anyhow, now he's president. So I've been writing about, by the way, that is some classy water. What the hell is that in there? Is it oh, it's citrus. Oh, okay. I thought it was a bug. Okay. So I started out in journalism back in the sunset of the Ronald Reagan era. And, in the late 1980s, I started the Baffler magazine in 1988, my friends and I in college. And I thought at the time that the rise of the conservative movement was the most consequential development of my lifetime. And I'm not just talking about Reagan here, but Margaret Thatcher, and the sense that and in France, Mitterrand, and the sense that we had that all the Western countries had collectively turned some kind of gigantic historical corner, which in retrospect we had. And so I decided that I would spend my career trying to understand what had happened. And what came to fascinate me over the years, as the years went by, what came to fascinate me was the paradox of the thing, the paradox of conservatism. Think about it. Our Republican Party here in the United States had basically inverted their historical brand image as the party of the highborn. They had remade themselves into these sort of, the plain-speaking pal of the common man, of the forgotten people who had spurned the Republican Party during the Great Depression. Now they were saying, by the time of Reagan, they were those people's best friend. Now, the payload of republicanism never changed. Of course, it remained in 1988 exactly what it had been, or pretty close to exactly what it had been in 1932. Never changed. And folks, just look at what conservatism has done to those average Americans once they welcomed it into their lives. What have its achievements been over the years? Well, there's tax cuts, of course, one after another after another. They've largely destroyed the power of the labor movement in America. And you guys are very young. You don't remember. We've been swapping stories about Kansas City. When I was a kid, Kansas City was a big union town. If there was a parade, unions had a float in it. If there was a blue ribbon commission, unions had a seat at the table. Today, it's all gone. That's the doing of the conservative movement. They've deregulated so much that you now have in this country disastrous financial crises brought on by fraudulent behavior in industries that the rest of the world thinks we still police. But folks, we don't. The days when our government got tough with monopolies or investment banks, those days are long gone. There are all sorts of objective ways, statistical ways even, of understanding how our society has been changed since the early 1980s. Houses, of course, are much, much, much bigger today than they were back then. University is massively more expensive. The college, the university where I went to graduate school back in the late 1980s, today costs $70,000 a year to attend. 4 years of that is close to $300,000. And you know the obvious consequence of that, of course, student debt is out of control. It is growing rapidly. As I go around the country and speak to audiences like this one, I am forever meeting young people who are $50,000, $60,000, $100,000 in debt. And folks, they're just starting out life that way. Anyhow, back to our numbers, or our objective factors. Members of Congress routinely quit their jobs these days in order to become lobbyists, because that pays a hell of a lot better. The price of a certain pill, I read, recently went from $13 to $750, a little prescription drug. And of course, the Dow Jones Industrial Average is at the once unthinkable number of 25,000, or it was this morning. Another set of numbers, another way of looking at this. From the middle of the 1930s, the Great Depression, up until the year 1980, you know, the inflection point. From the Depression up until the election of Reagan, the lower 90% of the population of this country, a group that we might call the American people, they took home 70% of the growth in this country's income. And when I was young, I thought that was normal. I thought that's what a democracy was. That's how it worked. The vast majority of the population took home the lion's share of the increase of what they produced. You look at the same numbers from 1997 up until 2016, so from the height of the dot-com bubble up until the 2016 election, and you find that this same group, the American people, pocketed none of this country's income growth at all. The upper 10% of the population, by which I mean the country's financiers and managers and professionals, they ate the whole thing. Back in 1980, according to the AFL-CIO, American CEOs made about 40 times as much as their average line worker. Today, it's 361 times. One amazing number I came across just the other day is that Jeff Bezos, richest man in the world, CEO of Amazon, owner of the Washington Post, Jeff Bezos earned as much in 9 seconds of 2017 as his average employee did in the entire year. One particularly fortunate American family has as much wealth as does 40% of the population put together. The main accomplishment of the 6 high-achieving individuals that make up this bunch, their accomplishment was to inherit shares in Walmart, the retailer that has sucked the life out of thousands of towns in the part of the country that I come from. Folks, I grew up around what passed in the 70s, what passed for wealthy people in Kansas City. The rich people of today make those people back then look like Soviets. So what I'm describing, these are staggering changes to see this kind of thing happen to a society. And they are more staggering still when you think about the politics of it all, the politics that made it happen, that allowed it to take place. Take the conservative movement's signature economic ideas, for example, and you know what they are. Privatize everything, let Wall Street run the economy, get tough with workers, and let the wages fall where they may. Folks, with a few exceptions here and there, these ideas have never enjoyed mass public approval. These are not the kind of things for which people clamor or rally in the streets by the millions. And were we to stage every election in this country as a referendum on this economic philosophy, and were the two parties to go out and take forthright positions on everything I just mentioned, privatizing, financialization, low wages, and so on, were we to have a clear debate and a clear referendum on these issues, every election would be a wipeout for the conservative movement. No question about it. Well, that's not what happened, is it? That is not how things have worked out. The conservatives took this deeply unpopular political agenda and made it into the elite consensus wisdom, not only of our country, but of the entire world. And that is the story of our time. That is the story of my adulthood. It's the story of our lifetimes. How the hell did they do it? How did they pull this off? So I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about this. I've been writing about it as I said, all my adult life, and I don't really want to talk about it too much, but I will say this. This is a discontented age, and the Republicans are weirdly comfortable with discontent. In fact, they are endlessly aggrieved. Modern American conservatives, I've been staying at this hotel, what is it called? The Mission Inn Hotel, and they have all these portraits of Republican presidents going back to Benjamin Harrison. Have you guys seen this? And they also have this giant chair they made for William Howard Taft. It's kind of awesome. But our conservatives today don't talk like those guys long ago. They don't speak to us in the manner of John D. Rockefeller, invoking the divine right of money. They don't talk like Herbert Hoover or William McKinley or Benjamin Harrison. They don't demand that the lowly learn their place in the great chain of being. That's not what they do. They do the opposite. They tell us that they are enemies of the elite, that they are the voice of the unfairly persecuted, that they are a righteous protest of the people on history's receiving end. They're sitting right there with you on the couch in front of your TV as you watch some football player or Hollywood star insult your values and mock your way of life. Organize discontent was the slogan of a conservative leader back in the 1970s. A guy who's very interesting. That was his slogan, organize discontent. I mean, that sounds like something that the IWW used to, in fact, they probably did say that, but the conservatives took it away from them. He put it on buttons. It was his personal slogan, organize discontent. And here's the crazy thing, that's what they do. They actually do that. And they deliberately mimic the historical left when they're going about organizing discontent. They deliberately mimic the historical left. That's what the Tea Party was. That's what it was all about. These guys out in the parks waving their signs and pretending to protest Wall Street banks. Or of course, the example that we can never forget, Donald Trump's presidential campaign, where he deliberately tried to make it sound like he was leading an old-time left-wing protest, deliberately. And the most startling evidence for this, I think, came in his final TV commercial. You know how they film what they call their closing statement. Both candidates will film what they call their closing statement. If you go and look at Donald Trump's, it's a kind of an amazing document. He attacks what he calls, it's a speech. He's giving a speech to a group of supporters in an aircraft hangar somewhere. And he's attacking what he calls the political establishment. And by the way, the imagery that goes along with the speech, it was much criticized because it's almost all pictures of Jews. Okay, and everyone was like, this is really creepy, not to mention borderline anti-Semitic. But the words where Trump is reading in his speech are amazing. He attacks what he calls the political establishment. And here's how he defines it. Okay, and I cannot do that accent of his, that Queen's accent. But you just imagine it. This is in Trump's voice. Okay, this is what he says: the political establishment. It's a global power structure that is responsible for the economic decisions that have robbed our working class. And he actually uses that phrase, working class, which is politicians almost never do in this country. Have robbed our working class, stripped our country of its wealth, and put that money into the pockets of a handful of large corporations. Trump is protesting large corporations and political entities. Entities. He goes on. This is Donald Trump now. The only thing that can stop this corrupt machine is you. The only force strong enough to save our country is us. The only people brave enough to vote out this corrupt establishment is you, the American people. And I heard that. I couldn't believe it because it sounds like something I might say. Seriously. It sounds like something you'd hear at a Bernie Sanders rally. It sounds idealistic. If you don't know any better, right? If you don't know anything about this guy. Trump versus the global power structure that has robbed us all, has robbed the working class, which is true, it has. Until the dude gets into office, and of course, what's the first thing he does? The gigantic tax cuts, deregulates the banks some more, does all of these extraordinary deregulatory favors for his campaign donors, for those very same large corporations that he was just pretending to, on and on and on. They do this all the time. This is how conservatives talk. They love to talk about the betrayed working class. It's not just Donald Trump. They all do it. Reagan did it. Newt Gingrich did it. George W. Bush did it. It's incredibly cynical. And at times it can be incredibly perverse. And I'm going to give you the most perverse example that I know of. It's from the CEO of the company that owned the Upper Big Branch mine. Do you know what this is? 29 miners were killed in an accident there. It's a coal mine in West Virginia. And this CEO, his name is Don Blankenship, later went to prison for violating safety rules. And but before all that happened, Blankenship threw a big Labor Day rally in West Virginia in 2009, where he climbed up on the stage and he said that he was there to defend American labor because no one else will. This is Don Blankenship. He goes on, says he's standing tall against our government leaders who, with their safety and environmental meddling, are American workers' worst nightmare. That's the CEO, right? Oh, the hell with it. Here's the deal, folks. They've been talking like this for decades, and they've been winning. How in the world do they get away with this? Okay, to answer that question, we have to shift our focus a little bit to the other party, and also because I'm a fair-minded guy, I want to talk about the other party in our system, the Democratic Party. Because these are the guys who are charged with keeping the Republicans in check and making sure that they pay for it when they cause financial crises or when they tell working people that they're on their side. And here's the secret. The Democratic Party isn't really interested in the job that I just described. I want to talk about the most glaring example of their disinterestedness in recent history, which is President Obama's response to the financial crisis after he became president in 2009, 10 years ago now. And this is a subject that I come back to again and again and again in my writing because I think it's one of the most important points in the history of the world, of the recent history of the world. It's caused this economic collapse that is still going on in some parts of Europe. It triggered this crazy right-wing populist backlash, et cetera, et cetera. But think about what it was like 10 years ago. Barack Obama had been elected president in this incredible wave of hope and enthusiasm, and I readily confess that I was one of the hopeful ones and I was one of the enthusiastic ones. And Obama had the country at his back. He had the world at his back. Hell, they gave him the Nobel Prize. Do you remember that? He had the entire world behind him. He had both houses of Congress, and he proceeded to continue the bailout policies of George W. Bush essentially unchanged. No big banks ever got put into receivership. No bailouts were unwound. No elite bankers were ever prosecuted. Folks, nobody even got fired. He had seats on their board. It was, he could do whatever he wanted with these guys. He did fire the CEO of General Motors. Oh, but not Goldman. Oh, no. What I'm saying is that Obama and his Democrats refused to change course when every sign was telling them it was time to turn. If you ask me, this was the end of the Reagan era. There it was, this financial crisis brought on by the very conservative, the philosophy that these people had put in place. It was the perfect opportunity to change course, and they didn't do it. It would have been good for the country to make a change. It was fully within their power to turn the wheel. It would have been overwhelmingly popular had Obama got tough with those bankers. Hell, we would have amended the Constitution, he'd still be president. Okay, that's a bit of an exaggeration there, but the country fully expected he and his Democrats to make that turn. That's why they thought they'd elected this guy, right? I mean, even when I say that, even the Wall Street bankers thought that he was going to, come down hard on them. They expected it. They thought Obama was going to take them to the woodshed. Instead, he foamed the runways for them, in the immortal phrase of his Treasury Secretary. So the billionaires came to him crying for handouts after having ruined Middle America as collateral damage, ruined Europe, ruined the entire economy of the world. And it was the perfect moment for liberals to reclaim their Rooseveltian heritage by governing forcefully on behalf of ordinary people, by declaring war on these overpowerful corporations, by demonstrating the power of the state to build a just and humane society. But they didn't do it. And I know the excuses. I've heard them. I live in Washington, and I've heard them ever since that day. Those Republicans were so clever. They played hardball. They were, really tough. They wouldn't vote for anything. But it's 10 years now. And from the long-term perspective, I think that what really mattered in that moment was the absence of democratic will. Instead of doing what the moment required, Democrats chose to help the banks get back up on their feet and stand by as inequality soared. All those statistics I gave at the beginning of the talk. They scolded their base, people like me. They scolded us for wanting too much and extended a hand of friendship to Silicon Valley and big pharma. And the task of capturing public anger was one they regarded with distaste. They left that to Tea Party demagogues and Donald J. Trump. Folks, we are going to pay for that failure for a long time. In my opinion, the Republican Party should have been ruined by the financial crisis every bit as much as Herbert Hoover's Republican Party was ruined by the Great Depression. And instead, we are right back where we started. The culture wars are back on, as you've every day there's a new one. The racist dog whistles are blowing constantly, the fighting over the flag, all over again. And the persecution mania of Fox News blaring from every TV screen. Folks, we are right back where we started. That crisis went completely to waste. We're going to have to learn that lesson all over again. Why? Why didn't Barack Obama take that perfect opportunity to blast Republican policies and shore up the middle-class society when it was right in front of him? Why? To answer that, I don't really have the answer for that. I'm going to speculate. Nobody really knows the answer to that. I think Barack Obama knows, but we have to wait for his memoirs. I don't know if we'll ever really know. But everybody wonders. I have my own theory, and that's what we're going to talk. Well, because I'm the speaker and you invited me, that's what we're going to talk about tonight. My stupid theory of what went wrong. And when I go to answer a question like this, I always look at history. That's always what I do. And my answer takes us back into the past of the Democratic Party. Back in the 70s and the 80s and the 1990s, the Democratic Party was always grappling with its identity and fighting over who they were, what they stood for, that kind of thing. And there were all of these different reform factions within the Democratic Party, and they fought like cats and dogs back in those days, but they all agreed on one thing. They all came together on one thing, and that was that Democrats had to turn away from the legacy of the New Deal with its fixation on working class people. Okay? What the Democrats could no longer be, they said, was the party of organized labor. The links with, again, I'm older than you guys, but when I was young, the connection between the Democratic Party and organized labor was like obvious, in your face, that's who they were, and everyone knew it. And all those links had to be broken. That's what the reform caucuses in the Democratic Party said. The Democrats had to be a different party that spoke for a different group. And the man that brought closure to that long Democratic Civil War was Bill Clinton, who brought, when he was elected president in '92, brought a new kind of Democratic administration to Washington. Now, back in the old days when a new Democratic president would come to town, they would pay homage in some spectacular way to the legacy of Franklin Roosevelt. Clinton did the opposite, did these amazing favors for Roosevelt's old enemies. He deregulated banking. He ensured, and it still blows my mind that he did this, ensured that derivative securities would be traded without government supervision of any kind, deregulated radio and telecoms, and basically put an end to the federal welfare system. It's a little chapter that is largely forgotten today, but we'll come back to that later on. Now, Clinton, and he's one of the main characters in Listen Liberal, and as you study the man's life, I don't like many of the deeds the things that he did as president, but he was a brilliant politician. He was very, very good at running for office. And he invented this strategy as a candidate for the presidency where Clinton would go out of his way to insult or distance himself from some traditional Democratic constituency, and then in this way assure the public that he was his own man and he wasn't beholden to anyone. And you might remember the most famous instance of this is where he set up a situation where he basically insulted Jesse Jackson to his face while the camera, they called it the Sister Soldier moment. It's largely forgotten today, but it was a big deal at the time. And here's what's interesting about this. I mean, a lot of interesting aspects to it, but then he becomes president. And this campaign strategy becomes a strategy of governance, basically body slamming the people who just got him elected. And the classic example in this case is the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, okay? And a little bit of history on this. NAFTA had been, it's the first of our modern trade deals that has this kind of it protects investment in a foreign country. It has a kind of supranational body to resolve disputes, this kind of thing. It was the first of these modern trade agreements that had been negotiated by Republicans, by George Bush's dad, by his administration. But Republicans, they couldn't get it through Congress because Congress in those days was controlled by Democrats, overwhelmingly of the pro-labor variety. And so it took a Democrat to get it done. And Clinton got it done. He and his friend Rahm Emanuel, they set up a war room and they drove this thing home. They fired up the steamroller and went right through the Democrats in Congress and got NAFTA enacted. Now, here's the fascinating thing. When Clinton did this, he wasn't just insulting labor, as he had done with Jesse Jackson. He wasn't just insulting these guys. He was conniving in their ruin. He was assisting in the destruction of their economic power, doing his part to undermine his own party's greatest ally, to ensure that in any future conflict between labor and management, management would always have the upper hand. Because henceforth, they got the atom bomb now. And labor doesn't have anything comparable. They can always threaten to move the factory to Mexico. And in fact, they do. Not move the factory, but threaten to do it. They do it all the time. It comes up constantly in any kind of negotiation between labor and management. So in getting NAFTA done, Clinton made the problems of working people materially worse. And folks, those people remembered. And NAFTA came back to haunt Hillary Clinton in a terrible way in 2016, with Donald Trump promising to renegotiate it at every step. Now, I'm not going to go into right now it's just so incredibly frustrating, but we'll talk about Trump's ideas about trade later on. But NAFTA is a fascinating issue. It really gets at the heart of what I'm talking about tonight because it was a class issue. It was as close as an issue comes to being just a straight class divide. And it gives us a good idea of who our modern Democratic Party cares about and who they aim to please. So professionals and the wealthy were very much in favor of NAFTA, and working people, unions, those groups were opposed to it. People with graduate degrees were no doubt impressed to learn that 283 economists, they used to boast about this all the time back then, 283 economists had signed a statement declaring that NAFTA will be a net positive for the United States, both in terms of employment creation and overall economic growth. Okay, so this is where you're supposed to like have a bitter chuckle because it did the opposite. And the people who opposed the agreement, their predictions are the ones that turned out to actually be, more accurate about what would actually come to pass. Anyhow, the new Democratic faction, the reform faction in the Democratic Party, regarded Clinton's achievement with NAFTA, his victory on NAFTA, as his finest moment. This was, all these people were celebrating this in Washington, D.C. This was an act of political bravery. There's a book, a very similar view that came out in a book from 1996 by a journalist who asserted that the president's few failings, talking about Clinton here, his failings were in the end balanced. And by the way, this is a book written by an admirer. This is a guy that thinks Bill Clinton was a great, historic, fantastic president. The book came out in 1996, for his reelection. It says, his failings were in the end balanced and even outweighed by his part in finally sinking the untenable old consensus of the New Deal and the crafting of a new one. That's why they liked him, because he sank the New Deal. They think that's a great accomplishment. That's the Democratic Party, right? So I'm sorry, I'm so cynical. There's a lot of good, I should just point out, there's a lot of good Democrats out there, and I'm not negative about all of them. This particular chapter, I think, has proven disastrous in the long run. Anyhow, who were the heroes of this new consensus? He talks about a new consensus replacing the old New Deal consensus. Well, who are the heroes of it? The same Democratic thinkers who kept advising the party to abandon workers in the New Deal had the answer. What Democrats needed to embrace was the emerging post-industrial economy. And, nothing really wrong with that, right? That's where we are. But here's the important point. The people that the Democratic Party needed to identify with were the winners in this new economic order. The highly educated professionals who populated our innovative knowledge industries. And if you were here for Professor Brint's talk earlier, we learned about who professionals are, but I'll just give you, it tends to be people with graduate degrees, people who work in, the classic ones, lawyers, doctors, engineers, that sort of thing. But today it's an enormous group of occupations, and it includes people like math PhDs who work on Wall Street, biochemists who make prescription drugs, that sort of thing. And that's basically who the Democratic Party is today. They are a class party. It's just not the working class. They are the party of highly educated professionals. Now, they have other constituency groups. We all know that. Minorities, women, the young, all sorts of different groups who align with the Democratic Party, but it's professionals who come first. They're the ones who sit in the front seat. They're the ones who have their hands on the steering wheel, and the rest of us ride in back. And it is their tastes and their manners that are always celebrated by liberal newspapers. And you know what I'm talking about here. Their favorite TV shows, their favorite restaurants, their artisanal cupcakes, their handcrafted cocktails. You know what I'm talking about. And there's always their particular way. I live among these people, right? It's like you could back me up on this, Professor Brint, but there is no group that is more unself-conscious. We'll talk about this later, but like as a class, they're like, no, we're not a class. We're just awesome. we have good taste, We scored high on the SAT. We're not a class. We just kick butt, that's all. So here's the deal. American liberalism started out as a populist movement, and I mean that in the American sense, in the positive sense, in the good sense. American liberalism started out as a populist movement, but today it is the opposite of that. It is a movement of winners and of the highly credentialed. And liberals have developed all of these flattering phrases for describing this favorite demographic group. They have all these wonderful terms of endearment. They call these high-achieving professionals the wired workers who will inherit the future. They are a learning class that truly gets the power of education. Don't you love that? A learning class. Some people are in the working class. But these people are in the learning class, right? And then here's one that you've certainly heard. They are a creative class that naturally rebels against fakeness and conformity. A creative class. Just think about that for a second. Creativity is the property of a social class. And we have to do everything we can to cater to this, creative class. We have to set up art zones in our cities. We have to write trade deals to protect them. Labor, the protectionism is bad when you talk about those people, but the creative class, we've got to keep them from fleeing for Denmark or something like that. Can't have that. Got to protect big pharma. And of course, democratic leaders themselves are always drawn almost exclusively from the ranks of this group. Think about the life stories of Barack Obama and Bill Clinton, and Hillary too. They're similar in a kind of remarkable way, that all of these people were plucked from lives of obscurity by prestigious schools. And look at their cabinet choices. Back when Obama was president, the Washington Post used to periodically run these essays marveling at the brain power in Obama's cabinet. Look at these degrees. They would list where all their, we got Harvard, we got Oxford, we got Rhodes Scholars, we got genius grants. God damn, we got a Nobel laureate as president. I'm sorry, I'm so cynical. I must stop. Anyhow, let me boil it down, okay? Here's the idea, basically. Professionals, this magical class, they are the heroes of history, They are the heroic figure that stands at the end of this debased dialectic of creativity and innovation. They are the number one constituency of the Democratic Party. And Democratic leaders are always drawn from the ranks of this same group. So folks, it is this shift that I'm describing, this shift from the working class or middle class, or however you want to put it, to professionals, that explains everything that is frustrating about our modern day liberalism. I mean, think about it. How do you get in a situation like we're in today, where inequality is growing, inequality is out of control? I mean, we are headed back to a 19th century style economy, basically. And the party of the left has trouble taking advantage of it, where the middle class is disintegrating and people are turning to a mountebank, a charlatan, like Donald Trump. How is that possible? It is only possible, folks, when the party of the left isn't interested in its historic mission. That's the only way that you get this combination of inequality and defeat. All right. Let's talk more about this, this idea of a party of the professional class. And this is something that I'm probably going to spend the rest of my, the hell with it. I'm never going to write about it again. So we'll talk about it now and be done with it. What does a party of the professional class look like? What does it believe in? Well, as you know, Professor Brint, there's one idea that they believe in above all others, and that is meritocracy. The conviction that the successful deserve their rewards, and that the people on top in our society are up there because, God damn it, they're the best, right? This is the first commandment of the professional managerial class. Everyone gets what they deserve, and what they deserve is defined by how they did in school. Okay, so that's the solution for inequality. You've seen this. Tom Friedman says it again, or used to say it. He's got bigger problems now, but they all used to say this all the time. That's the only answer for inequality. More education. That's the answer for that farmer out in rural Missouri who's watching his way of life blow away in the hot August wind, right? He needed to go to MIT. He needs to go to Stanford. That's the answer for them. Folks, this is not a philosophy for reducing inequality. This is a philosophy for rationalizing inequality, right? It's always your own fault. It's always your own fault because you screwed up in school. You didn't get a gold star in 3rd grade. Or you didn't graduate from high school. Or maybe you did graduate from high school, and maybe you even went to university, but you went to the wrong university, right? You didn't go to a good school, right? Or maybe you did go to a good school, but you studied the wrong goddamn subject. You didn't study a STEM subject. It's always your own fault. And 10 years from now, you know what they'll say? They'll be like, you screwed up. You studied a STEM subject. Everyone knew you're supposed to be studying Latin, right? Or classics, right? Or history, or French literature. The blame always goes back to you for inequality. You screwed up. Folks, this is a philosophy of winners, and the Democratic Party today is a party concerned with winners. And that's the left party in our system here in the United States, a party of new economy winners. And folks, it is their high-minded abandonment of principle that has made Trumpism possible, has made Trumpism inevitable. Okay, I want one more subject, and then I will shut up and we'll drink that beer back there. And that is how right-wing populism can be defeated more or less permanently. Now, after everything I've said, I have to confess, everything I've said, and I've been studying this my entire life, and right-wing populism, you know, what's the matter with Kansas? I've been writing about this for a long time, folks. But still, Donald Trump is never going to seem like a natural or inevitable president to me. And that is not merely because he is a cad in a shockingly cantilevered ducktail. That's what they call his hairdo, by the way, for those of you who didn't know. It's a DA, that's what they called it in the old days. That's not the thing. It's because I feel that right-wing populism is a freakish historical anomaly. And I know it has been running strong for decades, and I've been writing about it for years. But by its very nature, it is a put-on. It's a volatile substance. It is riven with all sorts of contradictions. It rails against elites while cutting taxes for the rich. It pretends to love the common people while insulting certain people for being a little too common. It worships the working man while steadily worsening his conditions. I mean, nothing in politics really seems right to me anymore. I keep assuming. Every morning I wake up and I assume that a society plumbing the depths of inequality ought to be a society turning to the left. That a populist moment ought to be a democratic moment. That the natural agent of public discontent ought to be the more liberal of our two parties. And one fine day I keep telling myself we're going to give that old TV set a smack and everything's going to snap back into focus and Americans will clearly understand what a mountebank Donald Trump is. And in January 2021, they will eject him from the White House in disgrace, a Herbert Hoover, a scowling mistake that we will never make again. And sometimes it seems like we're getting there. I mean, the enthusiasm is certainly on the Democrats' side these days. The liberal rank and file are more energized than I have ever seen them in my lifetime. Political novices are signing up to run for office all over the country. Democrats are ahead in any poll you care to mention. They did very well in 2018. But what might they do to continue their role? The only answer that I'm going to give has to do with the party's identity. Do the Democrats continue on as they have done before, making themselves more and more into an expression of professional class disdain, friend to the enlightened financier, careful curator of the Silicon Millennium? I don't think that's a good idea. Back in 1941, President Franklin Roosevelt set down his sort of vision of American political history, in which, as he put it, two schools of political belief, liberals and conservatives, fought endlessly throughout our history for primacy. Now, regardless, the name of the Liberal Party changed. The sort of how would you put it? Sometimes it would be the Democratic Party. At other times, it would be the Republican Party. But regardless of what it was called and sometimes it was the populists, but regardless of what it was called at any particular moment, he wrote, the Liberal Party believed in the wisdom and efficacy of the will of the great majority of the people. as distinguished from the judgment of a small minority of either education or wealth. Either education or wealth. What Roosevelt, of course, could not foresee was a party system in which the divide fell not between the few and the many, but rather between the small minority of education and the small minority of wealth. I mean, how could he have seen that his great majority would be one day split in two and offered a choice between enlightened billionaires on one side and vulgar, resentful billionaires on the other? And that really is the choice, right? Polluting billionaires versus recycling, bike lane billionaires, right? That's our choice. It's so awesome. Listen, we get that great Rooseveltian majority back together, I think, and they would be unstoppable. There is really only one set of successful politics for an age of inequality like the one that we are in today, and it naturally favors the party of Franklin Roosevelt. And Trump succeeded by pretending to be the heir of populists of the past, acting out this role as a kind of rough-hewn reformer who detested the powerful and really cared about working people. And now it's the turn of the Democrats to take it away from him. They may have to fire their consultants, and they may have to stand up to their donors, and they may have to find the courage to dump, they will definitely have to find the courage to dump the ideology of the 1990s, this catechism of tech, bank, and globe that everyone can now see is nothing but an excuse for an out-of-touch elite. But the time has come, folks. History is calling. Thank you very much. Now, what do we do? What's the procedure?
Okay, I'm going to call on people. Will you take a few questions?
Oh, that's what I'm here for.
Okay.
And by the way, and if there's anything you think I missed, you let me know.
I'll let you know. Let's take some questions from the audience. Okay.
Yeah, really good question. Could y'all hear that? Okay, what should the Democrats be doing to support good-paying jobs and making the economy work for everyone again? And there actually is a way to do that. We never talk about it in this country. I mean, we think of politicians tend to think in terms of government programs and that kind of thing, and those are helpful. But there's a really obvious answer that we never mention, and that is make it possible to form a union again in this country. It's one of the facts that has just absolutely changed the face of this country is that beginning in the 1980s, it became impossible for workers to form unions. And so the unionized percentage of the population in this country has been whittled down and down and down and down and down. They're something like below 7% or 6% of the private sector workforce now. But you don't really, I mean, you should have like government, higher taxes on the wealthy and better welfare programs and et cetera for people at the very bottom. But let people form unions. I don't want to say the problem will take care of itself, but it won't, of course. But that goes a huge way towards altering the, if you look at how the distribution of wealth and income have changed in this country, the famous, the Piketty charts, right, where it's there's staggering inequality in wealth and in income in the 1920s. Then all of a sudden it takes this huge dive with the New Deal and then is basically flat for decades and decades, and that's the great middle-class society that a lot of us were born into, and then it starts going up again in the 80s. And now we're at a point where we're back on a par with the most unequal, times in American life. And taxation is a huge part of that story, but deunionization is the huge missing element. And I would say that is absolutely essential. By the way, there are other things I would throw out there. Break up monopolies. I mean, you talk about, Again, this is something that started under Reagan. We stopped enforcing antitrust law in this country. The laws are on, by the way, this is one of the things that used to make me so mad about Obama. They would say, you know, he can't do anything, the Republicans won't vote for it. It's like, well, the laws against monopoly were passed in the 1890s. They're still on the books. It's just that presidents don't enforce them anymore. But, you know, he's entitled to do it. All he has to do is turn to his attorney general and say, go out there and, you know, go after Facebook. Amazon, you know, let's do a little investigation on these guys. And that would have miraculous effects for a lot of small businesses, farmers. Farmers are always particularly under the thumb of monopoly. But all of these, you know, small economic actors. I mean, they used to talk about the antitrust law. God, I'm going to forget what there was one of the Supreme Court judges, one of the famous ones, said it was the Magna Carta of, what is it, the Magna Carta of small business. It was the Antitrust Act. And we don't enforce it anymore. And small business is being wiped out. It's like, you know, it's obvious why it's happening. By the way, this is another, it doesn't matter. Trump made noise about this too. Of course he's not doing anything. It is extraordinary that I need to shut up. More questions?
Yes. Really was the basis of really strong political pull. And of course,
Yeah.
so what do you think about that?
What do I think about that? So he asked about socialism and what's my opinion of it, and should we be afraid of it, I guess. And it's its heyday back in the Depression and before that. And that's a really good point, because we always have to remember Franklin Roosevelt didn't just do what he did out of the goodness of his heart, although he was a great man and a good man and all that sort of thing. But he was also in a extraordinary economic crisis. He didn't really know what to do, and he was casting about for different solutions. And all the while he was doing that, he was being pressured from his left. You mentioned the Communist Party, which was never numerically big in America, but had a huge cultural footprint in the 1930s. This is a subject I've been researching lately, and it's actually fascinating how the kind of influence that they had. But then there were other left-wing politicians at the time. Huey Long, who has a bad name now because it sort of devolved. His reign in Louisiana devolved into dictatorship, was always pressing Roosevelt from the left for more redistribution. You also had very left-wing governors in other states. What's the guy's name in Minnesota in the 30s? Anybody remember? No. It was the governor of Minnesota. He was a farmer labor in what was called the Farmer Labor Party. Now they've merged with the Democrats. But Olson, what was his name? Last name was Olson. First name was anyhow. But also way to the left. And there was all of this stuff going on, this incredible ferment in the 30s, and it did force Roosevelt's hand to some way, but it also made him consider all sorts of different things that were in the air, and the Republicans were basically wiped out. So I'm not only am I not afraid of the word socialism, I used to, I think I don't want to call myself that. I'm more of a populist, in the good sense of the word, the sort of Kansas sense of the word. But I used to study populism, this movement in the 1890s. And when populism died, they all became Eugene Debs was one of their big leaders. They all became Eugene Debs style socialists. Not all of them, but a lot of them did. And so I think it's really important to have voices on the left challenging the Democratic Party and forcing them to the left. One of the things that really annoyed me about the 2016 election was this sense that although I wound up voting for Hillary in the general election, it annoyed me that her side seemed to regard the challenge from Bernie Sanders as illegitimate. And I thought it was, you need that debate. That debate is healthy. You want a robust debate. You want people to have to defend their decisions. That's what you do in a democracy. So I was happy with that debate, and I want to see that. I'm anxious for it to get started again. I want to see it. It's going to be really fun, I think. Well, or maybe it's going to be really awful. I don't really know.
Okay, back there and then over there.
You mean at the state level? Well, some of that's really, I mean, California is one of these states that's experimenting with all sorts of different things, but unfortunately the monopoly stuff has to be done at the federal level. The states aren't really, actually, what am I talking about? I think states can pretty much do whatever the hell they want, you know? But I'm not sure what the thing about monopoly is the laws are already there, and they were once considered really important. They're, nobody's going to repeal them. It just takes a chief executive with some backbone, who wants to. Trump does want to use them. It seems like he wants to use them selectively against Amazon, right? Because he owns the Washington Post, but that's not a good. That's not a good reason, There's all sorts of things states can do, but it's really tough when you don't have the taxing authority, which is ultimately the federal government. And a lot of the other powers. It's tough, but we will see. I mean, the Republicans are certainly experimenting with all sorts of awful things. In Wisconsin, for example, Scott Walker was running a little laboratory of like what happens when we completely destroy unions. Or Sam Brownback back in Kansas, let's get rid of taxes altogether and just see what happens, And but. I basically concentrate on the federal level, so I'm sorry I've given you a really disappointing answer. I apologize.
How we get out of this?
Good question. So the Janus decision at the Supreme Court. No, I'm God. It's. I think I even wrote an article about this. I've already forgotten what it was about. But it's basically it extends right to work nationally, right? To the public sector unions, right? So to unleash unions again. Well, when Obama first became president, they had a proposal to do it. It was called card check. And union organizing is a really complicated business in America, and the organizers almost always lose, because they have to jump through all these different hoops, and it gives management time to, counter-organize and hire a union-busting firm. There's all sorts of specialists in what they call union avoidance, and they bring these guys in, and they always win. And card check, you don't have to go through all that. The idea is everybody signs a card, and boom, they're organized. And then there are a bunch of other things that you can do to reform the process that would make it easier. But had they passed card check, I'm telling you right now, every Starbucks in America would be organized, because you just download the cards from the internet and boom, you got a union. Suddenly you're able to bargain with management. The thing to remember about unions, and I don't want to suggest that is the sum total of the answer to our current we got a lot of problems, and it's just one thing that I happen to know a lot about. But what's hard for people to understand is they look at the way unions have died in America, and they say, well, that must be because nobody wants to be in one anymore. But as a matter of fact, they poll working class people all the time and ask them this question. And I forget what the numbers are presently, but it's close to 50% of workers say they would like to be in a union. It's an unusually high number, given that only like 6% of them or 7 or 8% of them actually are. And then if you remove, the word union tends to be a red flag for a lot of people. So if you take that word out of the question and you say, would you like to be able to bargain with your boss? It's like 90%. Everybody's like, yeah, that's a good idea. That would rock. So look, once you make it possible to do that again, it would sweep the nation very quickly, like it did in the 30s. I mean, American labor history is a really kind of an unpleasant thing to study, because it's so violent. People were forever trying to organize unions, and then there'd be some horrible gunfight, or the police would show up and shoot everybody. All these awful things would happen, and then eventually, and this is because the force of the law was always arrayed on the side of capital. By the way, this was shocking to workers when they first found this out. There was a big strike at a steelworks in Pennsylvania, and the management of the mill, it was a Homestead, right? The management of the mill brought in Pinkertons with and the strikers got a cannon and like defeated them militarily, and took the Pinkertons captive. It's just the craziest story. And then the National Guard shows up, and the strikers are like, "Awesome, you're here to take our side." It's like, no. No, that's not it at all. And but then in the 30s, everything changed, and Roosevelt started taking the side of unions, and that was a huge change in American life. All of a sudden, they were legitimate, and all of a sudden, the police weren't going to shoot them down in the streets anymore. And this completely changed the equation. And that can happen again. And so you had this massive organizing wave in the late 30s and during World War II. Everybody was signing up for unions. Hell, they thought it was a patriotic thing to do. That could happen again. I talk way too much, folks. I'm so sorry.
I'm going to ask a question. I guess my take on this is a little more culturalist than you. The dramatist personae that I think you've left out are George Wallace and Kevin Phillips. And the reason I think those people are important is because they maybe didn't invent, but they certainly perfected the idea of the current bogeyman that really
Absolutely.
galvanized the right. So people who don't believe in religion, who have loose morals, minorities, criminals, and that kind of fear of those people who don't share our religious values, aren't of the same race and ethnicity, as major cultural figures, hate fear. I think I don't deny.
No, it's a very good point.
I don't deny that the decline of unions and Democrats turning away from labor. I agree with you about that. Puzzle that you haven't really touched on.
Yeah. That was in a different book. But George Wallace, if y'all, this is something from when we were young. Wallace was the governor. He was a segregationist governor of Alabama, and ran for president again and again and again in the late 60s and early 70s. And kind of a monster, but also kind of a genius, and invented a lot of the backlash themes that have now become, universal Republican campaign themes. So, for example, other than just all of what we call dog whistle racism, in all these ways of appealing to bigots without saying so openly, that's sort of his trademark. But then all these other ones, like the war on the press, that was him. He dreamed that up. He would have these campaign rallies. This is during the Vietnam War, and he would get the crowd to yell at the press. He would point out where the press was sitting, and Trump does the exact same thing. So Wallace ran as a Democrat, and then as an independent in '68, after he didn't get the nomination, and Richard Nixon saw this and realized the power of it. And you mentioned Kevin Phillips, who was an advisor to Nixon and wrote a book called The Coming Republican Majority, right? Is that, sorry?
The
Emerging Republican Majority. This is what they call the Southern Strategy. This was the invention of this idea. So Nixon, the Republican, takes this strategy from Wallace and uses it to peel off the Southern states from the Democratic Party. Back in the day, the Southern states used to be once they were solidly Democratic, but different kind of Democrat. It's a complicated story, and then now they're solidly Republican. And the guy who engineered that shift was Nixon by stealing Wallace's ideas, and they have never turned back from that. That is who the Republican Party is. And this is What's the Matter with Kansas is about, how these ideas became secularized so that they're no longer clearly associated with overt sort of bigotry, but but the resentment is there in huge force. And that's, extremely powerful. And it's been a real challenge for the Democrats to beat this. I want to point out one thing that a lot of you probably don't know, and that is, when I was young, the Democrats were always losing, poor for McGovern, and then Carter lost re-election, and then Mondale, and then Dukakis, and everybody was like, God, the Democratic Party, what losers. And then you had Bill Clinton come along, and his way of dealing with all of this stuff that I just described was kind of awful. It was to bid for the bigot vote, which he did with mass incarceration and with welfare reform, which is... So I was reading these biographies of Clinton in order to write Listen Liberal. And when I came to that part of the story, I guess I had forgotten it or blocked it out in my memory or something. And it was so horrifying to me, so shocking. And I know I'm getting away from your question. Do you mind if I just wander? Of course. It was so shocking to me. And the thing is that I want to be really clear that those things are not an option for any Democratic Party that I want to have anything to do with. Okay, things like welfare reform and mass. Do you know what welfare reform was? He abolished the New Deal welfare program, and it was always attacked on racist grounds. Always, 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 always. But again, the Republicans couldn't get it done. It took a Democrat to do it, and God damn it, he did it. And this is just the most incredible betrayal of his, in my opinion, of his. I'm sorry, I'm not a big fan of Bill Clinton's, but for me now, I know he got reelected, and that's his allies and his biographers would always say, well, he had to do that to get reelected, and he did it, and he got reelected. But that's just that is not the way to deal with this with the stuff that we're talking about here.
One more question. Yes.
Could we get your comment on the Democratic Socialists in America?
Go get them, guys.
And chapter that meets in
Democratic Socialists. Sounds good to me.
More like a
Yeah.
I have the feeling that the turning point was the loss of the political morality of the progressive movement to the policy rationalism of the new. You haven't pushed it back quite far enough. Anchoring your analysis.
Is this you mean when you mean like the mass movement style populist La Follette?
Right.
Yeah.
Teddy Roosevelt.
Yeah.
Pollard.
So my difference with so could y'all hear the question? This is a history question, which is that the New Deal was itself a kind of, how would you put it? It was a weaker version of something that had come before, which was a strong left tradition in this country. So isn't that Richard Hofstadter makes that argument, but he makes it in the reverse, which is he hates populism and progressivism and thinks that the New Deal with its rationalism was this great improvement. And you know what my opinion is? I think the New Deal was populist and progressive. I think that if you look beneath the surface, the culture of the New Deal was, blaringly populist in a good way, in the good sense. And so I think that tradition actually survived and made itself felt right up into, there are traces of it right up into the present day. I don't think it ever really died out. And I think Roosevelt himself was a great embodiment of it. And I think, who else was Henry Wallace, as long as we're talking about Wallaces. Henry Wallace, his vice president, who loved that language. And you look, during World War II, they sold that war. Well, it wasn't hard to sell it once we got attacked, but sold that war as a great progressive adventure. Not adventure, that's the wrong word, but a great progressive crusade. See what I'm getting at?
But I think that party of the policy wonks.
Yeah.
Is the inheritance of the complexity of how to solve.
Yes, okay, I see where you're getting at. Can I say one more thing about that, and then I will shut up for the night and we'll drink that beer? And that is a really, really excellent point, because the New Deal is always regarded by apologists for the modern sort of bureaucratic state. They always say, well, the New Deal that's the point of beginning. That's where we got started. And that's also the golden age. That's when it worked. That's when you had the geniuses in government, and look what they did. They got us out of a depression. They won World War II. It was fantastic. And I'm, by the way, for a long time, I was a believer in that, in the government by wonks and government by experts. And it took Barack Obama to cure me of that. Like all that stuff I was talking about, the cabinet of geniuses. The cabinet of geniuses who then let their fellow geniuses off the hook, these guys on Wall Street, and can't seem to figure out what's going on with Silicon Valley and miss the boat again and again and again. And so I lost my faith in government by genius. That's sort of the origin, by the way, of Listen Liberal. That's where I started. And so I was wondering, and so I was like, well, it worked in the 30s. Why didn't it work this time? What went wrong? And once you pose the question that way, and then you start saying, well, let's compare them. Let's compare the New Deal geniuses, if you want to call them that, to the Obama geniuses. And once you do that, you immediately notice a huge difference, which is the Obama people are orthodox. They are the cream of the professions. Larry Summers, president of Harvard. All of these guys who are at the top of the most respected member of their profession. The people that Roosevelt had, remember the economics profession was destroyed by the crash in 29. All of the leaders looked like fools. They were into the gold standard, this ridiculous stuff. He cast all of that aside and he brought in all of these really hyper unorthodox thinkers. I used to talk about this a lot. It's fascinating. Like the guy that he brought in to run the Federal Reserve was a banker from Utah called Mariner Eccles. Mariner Eccles had never run, anything, but he was a brilliant man, like really brilliant, and invented Keynesianism without ever having read Keynes, invented this American version of deficit spending. But the New Deal was filled with guys like this, who were from, or Francis Perkins, right, from Columbia, who was the labor secretary, also brilliant, but really unorthodox. And Henry Hopkins, another one, who's a social worker from Iowa, or the guy that ran his bailout program. They bailed out the banks in the 30s too. But Roosevelt's bailouts, they would go into a town and they'd be like, well, we don't like the way you dealt with the crisis. You're all fired. They did that. They did that all the time. They would put banks out of business if they didn't like the way they were managed. And you're like, well, who the hell did that? Which guy? And it turned out he had found this banker, a small town banker from Texas, and put him in charge of the bailout agency. And that's the guy who, this guy had nothing to do with investment banks, with New York City, with any of that stuff. He was from Texas. And it's like, in some ways, that's the genius of the New Deal. As he's taking, I'm sorry, I talk too much. He's taking ideas from all over the place, not just Harvard, not just Rhodes Scholars. And that's the sort of, that's what we need again. I mean, you look at the professional life in Washington, D.C. now, and it's a monoculture. It's all these guys standing around agreeing with each other about every last little goddamn thing. They never get challenged, And we need a complete reinvigoration of that. I'd like to see it happen one of these days. Probably never will. Thank you so much, folks.